Hello, hello. It's Veronica, the heart dietitian. Today I have a fun presentation for you. It's myths or facts all around heart healthy eating. So these are common myths that I hear when I'm seeing clients individually. They come in and they say, "Hey, Veronica, my doctor told me this." So I presented this presentation deck that I'm going to share with you to physicians and pharmacists at a recent presentation a few weeks ago. And I thought, hey, it'd be fun to share it here too, because these are common things we hear, and it's good to know if it is actually a myth or if it's a fact and why. So feel free to play along with me. And when I present the question, think about it. Is it a myth or is it a fact? And then I'll tell you why. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. So the first question is, are all fats bad for your heart? So think about that. Is it a myth or is it a fact? And it is a myth. Not all fats are bad for your heart. So there's two main types of fat in our food system. There's something called unsaturated fats and then something called saturated fats. I guess there's a third one too. It's called trans fats. So we have the unsaturated fats, which is actually the heart protective fat. That's the fat we want to eat more of. And that is included here. These examples: avocado, nuts, seeds, fatty fish like salmon, as well as olive oil. So those are heart protective, and we do want to include them at every meal or snack if we can. The other two types of fats, trans fat and saturated fat, when we eat those types of fats in excess, then that can actually raise our cholesterol, raise our inflammation, and increase our risk of heart disease. So we don't want to just eat any type of fat. It's really important to differentiate the two types or three types and eat the one that's heart healthy for us. So in the past, I've had a lot of clients come in a low-fat diet. They had said that their physician or pharmacist suggested a low-fat diet. And this is why I put this myth in, because it is something I hear often. Maybe 20 years ago, yes, we did suggest a low-fat diet because that's what the research told us. But since then, we've been able to see the trends of something like a Mediterranean diet, which is a high-fat diet that can be so heart protective. It can prevent a first heart attack and stroke, or even a second heart attack and stroke if you start eating that way after. It can also reduce our blood pressure, our cholesterol, reduce inflammation, many types of cancers, and help with dementia as well as arthritis. So lots and lots of benefits with that type of eating. And it is a high-fat diet. However, they prioritize the unsaturated fats. So really important here. So that's why I said it is a myth, but we want to eat fat that's coming from the unsaturated fats. Okay, my second myth or fact. So think about this one. Is reducing salt intake necessary to change heart health? And it is a fact. So it's not, so I have it here, reducing salt intake, is that necessary to change heart health? And it isn't. So reducing salt intake isn't necessarily a way to protect heart health. However, reducing sodium from processed foods and restaurant meals can help with, or it can be heart protective. So let's think about this. So salt from the salt shaker is made up with two molecules. We have sodium and we have chloride, so they're combined. And the sodium in salt can increase our blood pressure if we have too much of it. When we look in North America, where the most sodium is coming from in our diet, from the salt shaker, it's only 10 to 25%, but from processed foods and restaurant meals, it's 75%. So what I would rather health professionals like physicians and pharmacists discuss with their clients is to not necessarily reduce the salt shaker, but reduce processed foods and restaurant meals. So this is really important because processed foods don't really provide a lot of heart protective nutrients, right? They're processed. So that means they're stripped of a lot of nutrients in order for us to cook the food faster, right? Or eat it faster, or perhaps it's loaded with sodium and other additives to make it taste really good. So they're not providing us any benefit anyways. And if we can cut out those foods, we can reduce our sodium drastically, right? If we just focus on reducing the salts from the salt shaker, it will make a little bit of an impact on our blood pressure. However, salts can be used to help flavor heart protective foods, right? So eating more fruits and vegetables, even plant-based proteins, whole grains, sometimes a little bit of salt on those foods can make them taste better. And we consume more of them, and therefore we're consuming more heart protective foods. And when we don't overdo it, we use it in moderation, it still will keep us within the limit of our sodium intake for the day. So it's a little bit of just more specific information when we're talking to people about reducing sodium. I would say instead of reducing sodium as a general term or reducing salts, I would specifically say let's reduce processed foods or restaurant meals and try to cook at home more often. Another myth or fact, so think about this one. Are high cholesterol foods the main cause of high blood cholesterol? Is that a myth or is it a fact? And it is a myth. So high dietary cholesterol foods, things like eggs or even shellfish like shrimp, are not the main cause of high blood cholesterol. The nutrient saturated fat is. So eating too much saturated fat can increase our blood cholesterol levels. So when we look at this plate here, a typical breakfast meal that you may have out when you're at a restaurant, you have your bread, you have your eggs, and then you have processed meats. So it could be bacon or it could be sausage, ham, lots of options there. But when we look at this plate, it's not the eggs that are increasing our cholesterol levels, but it's actually the processed meats. So it's a kind of a switch of when we looked at the research. Before, we didn't really isolate dietary cholesterol and saturated fat, so we kind of grouped them together, especially when we're eating eggs. We often eat it with processed meats. And so back in the day, they thought eggs did contribute to high blood cholesterol levels because of the foods it was associated with, the foods that it was eaten with. But then when they were able to separate them out, they realized it's not necessarily the cholesterol found in foods, but it's that saturated fat. So it's the processed meats, the high fatty animal meats that are contributing more to the high blood cholesterol levels. Another myth or fact, this was a presentation to Canadian physicians and pharmacists, so that's why it's here, but it says Canadians. But I can generalize it to North Americans because this is true for them as well. So most North Americans don't get enough fiber in their diets. Is that a myth or is it a fact? And it is a fact. So North Americans are eating about half of the recommended dietary fiber in a day. So in general, it's about 12 grams of fiber in a day that North Americans are eating. For women, it's recommended to eat 25 grams of fiber in a day. And for men, 38 grams of fiber in a day. So for men, it's probably a third of an intake when we break that down by the different sex. So something to consider that we all need to work on is increasing our fiber intake. And where does fiber come from? Well, fiber comes from plants. So eating more plant foods can increase our fiber. What are plant foods? That's our vegetables, our fruits, our whole grains, plant-based proteins, things like legumes, tofu, edamame, tempeh, nuts and seeds, I guess, would contribute there too. Things like avocado, lots of different plant foods are the ones that would increase the fiber intake. Animal proteins, animal meats, animal foods don't have fiber in them. The fiber is coming from plants. And I guess eating more fiber can help with many things too. It can help lower our cholesterol levels. It can help with our digestion. It helps to feed our microbiome. So a lot of the bacteria in our gut feed off of the fiber. It's what they like to eat. So the more fiber we eat, the more bacteria we have, the good bacteria we have in our gut to help fight off infections and diseases, reduce inflammation. Fiber can help with reducing cancers like colon cancer. It can help with weight management. It keeps us full longer because it takes a long time to digest. It helps with our blood sugar management. Like the list goes on and on. Fiber is amazing and we're not eating enough. So let's think about ways to increase that. Another myth or fact is eating eggs and seafood significantly increases the risk of heart disease. Is that a myth or a fact? And I think we did just kind of go over that. It is a myth. Eggs and seafood are a great form of low saturated fat protein. Remember, I talked about the saturated fat, eating too much of that nutrient can increase our blood cholesterol levels. Well, eggs and seafood are actually low in saturated fat. So that's why it doesn't necessarily increase our blood cholesterol levels. This is another funny thing, a funny statement that people come into my office talking about. So a lot of individuals come in saying, hey, Veronica, my cholesterol is high, or my blood pressure is high, or I just had a heart attack or stroke, but I'm a vegetarian. So I'm surprised that this is happening to me. And the myth or fact here that I'm presenting is, does going vegetarian, does it automatically lower your risk of heart disease? And that's not necessarily the case. So going vegetarian means that you're eating mainly plant foods, which is great, right? I just said plant foods have contain fiber and they have so many nutrients. However, you could still be vegetarian and eat mostly processed foods, right? Because some of processed foods do come from plants. So it could be low fiber plant foods that are stripped of nutrients, right? So it's really important to think about, if you are going to go vegetarian, or let's say if a health professional is recommending a vegetarian diet to individuals, it's important to talk about the types of foods to eat, right? It's not just going vegetarian will make you healthy. It's actually eating more plant foods. So eating more plant proteins, those legumes I have there, whole grains. So making those grains less processed. And then our nuts and seeds, really great source of fiber and nutrients. And then of course that color, thinking about having color on your plate at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, super important. Another myth or fact here, are Canadians eating too much protein? So do they eat too much protein? And they are not necessarily eating enough protein for breakfast. So a lot of the time I hear that too much protein can cause kidney disease or put too much strain on my kidneys. But when we look at, again, I can generalize this to North Americans. When we look at North Americans, we generally have our protein at lunch and dinner, and we hardly have any at breakfast. So when we're looking at research and we think about how much protein North Americans are eating in a day, then we can say, yes, they're meeting their protein needs. But when we break it down into each meal, it's actually not true. North Americans are not eating enough protein at breakfast, and they're eating too much at dinner. So too much protein probably isn't healthy for us, and that could put strain on our body. And it's also, our body only needs a certain amount of protein at a time. So any extra protein we have there is usually just kind of stored as fat or extra calories for later, right? Our body says we only need this much protein, and then the rest we'll just store it for later as fat when I need extra energy. So if we can put more protein at breakfast, I think it would be really heart healthy for a lot of North Americans. So thinking about your breakfast, and if it's containing any of these foods, these are some great examples to try to incorporate more protein at breakfast. So things like eggs, Greek yogurt is fantastic, cottage cheese, salmon, it has smoked salmon here, but oftentimes I just put like leftover filet there. We have scrambled tofu as an example, pumpkin seeds, as well as oats contain some protein as well. So no, North Americans are not consuming enough protein, especially at breakfast. that's it. That is the presentation. I thought it'd be fun to do. Let me know what you think in the comments below if you enjoyed this type of presentation, or if you think any statement should have been a myth or a fact. I'd really love to hear from you. See you next time.